Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in what is going to be an excellent discussion about the future of NATO and with a more aggressive and assertive Russia. My name is Paul Fagan. I'm the Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy here at the McCain Institute, and we really are pleased that you could join us today. Obviously, the conversation couldn't come at a more relevant time with Russian troops amassing along the Ukrainian border, flexing its military might. Also, the US, NATO, the rest of Europe is in constant talks with their Russian counterparts to avert some kind of war, as we are already in a crisis. As we are the McCain Institute, we are following in the legacy of Senator McCain, and there was no greater champion for the transatlantic alliance, for NATO, but also for Ukraine, for its freedom, for its sovereignty, for its democracy. And all of our speakers today can speak to all of those issues, and we could be more proud to have all of you with us to talk about something that was extremely important to Senator McCain. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our moderator and our panelists. First, we have David Kramer, a former colleague, friend, an expert on all issues dealing with Russia. He's currently just moved down almost to Texas, but he's the managing director of global policy at the George W. Bush Institute. Next, we have Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She is the president of Farkas Global Strategies. She's had a long career dealing with European affairs, but was from 2012 to 2015 the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, Balkans, the Caucasus, and conventional arms control. Next, we have Ambassador Jüri Luik. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Ambassador. He is the permanent representative of Estonia to NATO. Very pleased to have you, and the former defense minister of Estonia. And finally, we have Edward Lucas, currently the non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, also known as CEPA. He's been covering Central and Eastern Europe since 1986, Russia, Central and Eastern Europe for The Economist, The Times, and many other publications. So we are so pleased to have all of you join us today. And with that, I'm going to put my cell phone silent and turn it over to David.
Paul, thanks so much, and thanks for including me in this session as my dog tries to climb up on me just as I start speaking. But it's really great to do this event with three dear friends. And as you rightly noted, Paul, the timing for this, unfortunately, is very relevant to what's happening. Russia has been aggressive for a long time, and in particular these days toward Ukraine, but there are other countries, including Estonia, where Jüri Luik is from, that was the target of a massive cyber attack in 2007. Of course, Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014, and ongoing aggression toward Ukraine and Georgia that we have seen. This campaign is accompanied by certainly a disinformation campaign, a propaganda effort on the part of the Kremlin. And so we will get into both parts of this. And what we will do to start is I'll ask each of the panelists to offer a few brief opening remarks. Then I'll lead a discussion with them, and then we'll turn to audience questions. And we would ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think you've all done Zoom long enough, you know how to do that. So without further ado, if I could turn to Jüri first to kick us off with a perspective there. I assume you're still in Brussels, Jüri. And ask you to go first, and then we'll turn to Edward, and then for Evelyn for opening comments. So Jüri, please.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me. And let me say at the beginning that indeed many people in Estonia remember Senator McCain, and I must say McCain was right on all accounts when it comes to Russia. There were people who criticized him, people who thought that he's overblowing the risk Russia is presenting to us. But I think, sadly, the events have proven that he was absolutely spot on. Now, the issues I am dealing with at the moment here at NATO are obviously all connected to Russia and to the ongoing crisis. The issues of environment, which were part of the new NATO's agenda, have been cast aside, and we are really dealing with the Russian invasion as the main event. I mean, there are two trends of work here, obviously. One is we are very closely following the movements around Ukraine, the Russian behavior, the consolidation and gathering of massive amounts of Russian troops. On the other hand, we are also kind of molding and creating consensus. You know, NATO has 30 members, while the general spirit of our understanding how the world goes around is broadly the same. There are, of course, a number of differences, especially now that we have to constantly make a number of critical decisions. At the same time, there are obviously a number of decisions which are undertaken not by NATO as an organization, but by different allies, notably, of course, the United States. Especially everything to do with Ukraine in particular are dealt mainly by allies, separate allies. For instance, there are a few allies, and again, notably including the United States, who have decided to provide weapons to Ukraine. Estonia has provided weapons to Ukraine. We are very grateful to the US government, which extremely quickly gave us, you know, because of the end user certificate, it's necessary, gave us the green light to provide Javelin missiles to Ukraine, which I believe are very much needed asset there. And of course, the United States itself has provided large amounts of Javelin systems and Javelin missiles to Ukraine, which is very important. On the other hand, obviously, the primary task of the alliance is to guard allied territory, and there are ongoing discussions as well as a number of steps the alliance has already taken and is ready to take should something very serious happen, including, of course, the invasion. You might say that very serious things have already happened. And of course, I'm very happy to say that the alliance is thinking and taking steps in protecting the allies. And these activities will only increase as the Russian concentration of Russian troops will increase. And then, of course, there is the diplomatic track. I mean, it's fair to say that there are countries who are more enthusiastic about the diplomatic track and perhaps countries who are less enthusiastic. Nobody's against diplomacy, but the question is, what is the role of diplomacy at this particular juncture? Russians have quite skillfully, of course, depicted this situation as part of the major onslaught of NATO, and Ukraine being kind of one aspect of that NATO's general policy, which obviously is not true at all. It's a major lie Russians have been peddling for years and years, but now they have added the strong military component to their information warfare and to the propaganda. So the question is, how can we mitigate this? How can we use the diplomatic track without, so to say, selling out the crown jewels? And that is a complicated issue. We worked hard in providing a response to Russian, which essentially amounted to a Russian ultimatum. I think NATO's response was clear, principled, and essentially it said that we are not ready to close NATO's door to any European country, including, of course, Ukraine. We are not ready to have second and first-class allies. And of course, we are not forgetting about, which I think Russia would like us to forget, we are not forgetting about the fact that Russia has already invited numerous countries on its neighborhoods and occupying a large swath of territories of these countries like Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine itself, obviously notable. We are not forgetting about it. There are areas where we could have discussions like arms control, but here also, as always, the devil is in details. I mean, there are issues of arms control which might limit the movement of the freedom of movement of the alliance, like the issues of exercises, etc., etc. And here we have to be extremely careful in how far we are ready to go. Broadly, the US and NATO responses are similar, but I'm sure Russia will try to sort of separate them. Again, in the good old spirit of information warfare. I saw that Lavrov has already said that NATO's response was shameful and US response was high-grade diplomacy. So it's clear that this kind of information warfare is going on. I've seen both responses, and they are both kind of very, very clearly based on the same principles and same ideals. So I see this mainly as an information warfare trick. Thank you.
Jüri, thank you so much. Appreciate your kicking us off. I'm not sure if Foreign Minister Lavrov knows what shame is, but nevertheless. Edward, let me turn to you next, if I could, please, sticking with the European continent, even if you're not in the EU anymore.
Thanks so much, David. And it's great to see so many friends, not only on the panel, but also in the audience. We have a lot of expertise here, and I look forward to the Q&A. So Estonians don't like being praised publicly, but I'm going to do this. My old friend Jüri Luik said that Senator McCain was right. He was, but actually Estonia was right. Estonia was really, really right. And Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and others warned us right back in the early 90s about this. And one of the most, I think, corrosive, almost devastating information problems we face at the moment is the idea that this is a new problem, or if it's not exactly a new problem, it's a problem that dates from NATO enlargement or expansion. Somehow we did the wrong thing and now we're paying a price for it. And if anyone hasn't read it, I do recommend just Googling Lennart Meri, Hamburg speech, 1994. And there's a speech that the then Estonian president, Lennart Meri, gave to a Baltic Sea regional conference in Hamburg of such crystalline prescience and clarity. It's really hard to imagine that people didn't take it seriously then. But the people who gave us those warnings, and they gave the warnings in Brussels and Berlin and Washington and London and other Western capitals, were ignored and patronized and belittled. And I think we in what one might call the Old West have to start off from a position of great humility here. We got this wrong. We got this really wrong, and we got it so wrong that 14,000 Ukrainians are dead as a result of our failure to see the threat we faced from Russia and to see it early enough. And in this latest round of what I think has been a kind of 30-year geopolitical tussle, Russia's already done really well, I'm afraid. I mean, we've done some good things, and I applaud all the things that my own country and others have done. But Russia has, first of all, showed it can act with impunity. Yeah, this is Tony Soprano is already outside your house with his thugs, and no one's moved him on. This is demanding not money with menaces, but geopolitical benefits, with menaces, and he's got away with it. He has not suffered immediate, harsh pushback of the kind that might make him think that was a really bad idea. I'm never going to do that again. So he's got impunity. He's highlighted the divisions and distractions that so plague us, the distraction of being worried about China and so many other important things, and more importantly, the divisions within the EU, within NATO, within the Atlantic Alliance, and within countries, on very sharp display, I would say, particularly in Germany, where we have Annalena Baerbock saying things we've always wanted German foreign ministers to say, but then Olaf Scholz saying no, but we must have dialogue. And according to Bild, that Russland is Chefsache, Russia is the boss's business, and so we see the foreign ministry rather sidelined. He's also, I think, succeeded in shifting the kind of negotiating window where we are now saying, if you don't invade, or if you invade Ukraine, then we will cancel Nord Stream 2, which is basically saying, if you don't invade Ukraine, we won't cancel Nord Stream 2. And actually, we had very good reasons for cancelling Nord Stream 2 even before he started massing troops on the Ukrainian border. And we see several other things as well, with similarly that our negotiating cards are now contingent on him invading, which means if he doesn't invade, then we won't play them. So he shifted the window. And what we're really seeing, I think, in the West is that we are negotiating with ourselves about how we pay off Putin. Now, those outcomes range from the completely disastrous of the kind advocated by the Quisling Institute, so I mean the Quincy Institute, I misspoke there, I do apologize, in terms of, let's get out of isolationism and appeasement, through to some quite sensible ideas, which we can explore in the Q&A, and I'll get onto in a moment. But we are fundamentally arguing with ourselves and not with Russia. And that division in the West is Russia's biggest asset, and it's self-inflicted. Nobody put Russian tanks on the streets of our countries and said, sacrifice your energy security in pursuit of cheap Russian gas, sacrifice your financial security in pursuit of dirty Russian money, just to give two examples. No, we did that to ourselves because we were naive and greedy and complacent and basically stupid. So what do we do about that? Well, obviously there's a whole load of diplomatic and military things. We need to make sure that the war is unwinnable. Putin won't start a war that he can't win, and so there's a hard military edge both in Ukraine and in the Baltic states. And we also need to do a lot more and do it quickly on resilience to blunt the edge of fear, if you like. So improving our own energy security by sending lots of LNG tankers heading this way so that Putin's threatened gas cutoff doesn't become so threatening, beefing up our cybersecurity so we're not scared of Russian cyber attacks and so on. There's a great deal we can do on the resilience front. But I think that as we're talking about information here, I'd like to concentrate on shifting the window of discussion, the framework of analysis. We are dealing with a large slice of the population which doesn't have the worldview, the sort of shaping events that I grew up with, the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Polish Pope, martial law in Poland, the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are not even history because they're too recent to be taught in history classes. People just don't really know about them. There's no scarring fear of the communists might win. This is a generation which is slightly anti-American, if not in cultural terms, perhaps in political terms. It's, if not pacifist, at least sort of Pacific. And it worries a great deal about climate change and things like that, and doesn't have our preoccupations. So what do we do? Well, I think we can reboot the discussion a bit on arms control, and if we were able to talk to the Brezhnev Kremlin about nuclear weapons, we can certainly talk to the Putin Kremlin about it, and we will, I think, have to back away from our previous position of saying that we will talk only when China is also willing to talk, and reckon that it'd be good to get Russia nailed down on anything from space to strategic nukes to battlefield nukes to ground launch cruise missiles and the whole INF piece through to military transparency and so on. But there's a big arms control agenda there. And I have to say, although I'm basically pretty hostile to Putin, I think there are some areas where the Russians have some room for complaint about some of the things that have happened. So there's plenty of room on that. I'd also suggest we relaunch the Helsinki process, but with a digital twist. interest, we are, as in advanced industrial countries, we all have an interest in the rules for the 21st century of the digital economy and digital society. So let's start talking to the Russians about that with a kind of digital Helsinki and see where we get. The worst that can happen is that nothing happens, but at least it's good. And in those Helsinki negotiations, of course, everyone's in the room. What we don't want is closed door meetings with the Americans and the Russians discussing everything else, and we have to suck up the consequences of the kind of Yalta 2.0. The point about Helsinki is that everybody comes, and the Russians will have to be in the room with the Baltic states and the Swedes and the Finns and the Ukrainians and others. And the other point, which I think that we don't play enough at a government level, is to really highlight the what kleptocracy and imperialism really mean. The younger generation really dislike imperialism and colonialism. These are big issues for them, and they get very angry about things that happened 150 years ago or 200 years ago, whether it's the colonialism in Africa, the slave trade, all these other dreadful things that scar our own histories. And I think we can make a bit more of an effort to say this is happening right now in Russia. Russia is an imperial power that is trying to hang on to influence in its own colonies, its former colonies, and is willing to kill quite large numbers of people in order to do so. And I think Maxim Eristavi, if any of you follow him on Twitter, he's a young Ukrainian who does a brilliant job in framing this in the sort of language that the younger generation, the kind of so-called woke generation, absolutely understand. He talks about Russia's attempt to maintain its cultural and linguistic hegemony, the use of the use and abuse of history, and so on. And I think that's a very strong point. And the other one, which I think has also got legs, is highlighting the greed and abuse of power that's inherent in the Putin system. Everything that a conscientious, idealistic young person in the West dislikes about their own country is 100 times worse in Russia. If you worry about campaign finance and the fungibility of wealth and power in a Western country, well, just try looking at the fungibility of wealth and power inside Russia, where the people who own the country just run it without any pretense of keeping some sort of Chinese war between the two systems. So I think that we are not yet done. We are losing so far, but the game's not over yet. We need to approach this from a position of humility, but also from self-confidence. We have some excellent cards to play in terms of unity and decisiveness, which we can do. We did it in the past, we just need to do it again. And also in reframing the narrative a bit in a way that puts Putin at a particular disadvantage and may help unite our own sides. And can I say in advance that I agree with everything that Evelyn is about to say.
Edward, thank you. That was very prescient on your part. Evelyn, over to you, please.
Well, first of all, David, thank you and the McCain Institute for putting this panel on, for including me. I think the late senator would be proud to hear everything the good ambassador and my friend Ed Luce have just said. Both of these gentlemen actually were very early on, as you know, calling out Russia, the threat posed by Russia. And as was Senator McCain himself. So I think it is an interesting group that you have arrayed here. I don't include myself in that category. I have to confess that I wasn't quite aware of the threat, although I was aware of the concern about the threat. So from the Baltic states working for the SACEUR in the 2010 to 12 timeframe, we were aware that there was a lot of concern, and of course we were aware of the attacks on Estonia and other such actions. But really, even the invasion of Georgia, unfortunately, again with the exception of Senator McCain, many people in Washington, and at that time I was still on the Hill, were unaware of the threat Russia really would pose to the global order. And so I think I want to just add a few items here, since the topic is NATO. And I think it bears a little bit of reminder to the audience that when we decided to keep NATO alive after the Warsaw Pact fell apart and it was the end of the Cold War and we were trying to establish a good constructive relationship with the states that came out of the Soviet Union, we did not say to ourselves, the leadership of NATO did not say, now we are going to keep this alliance in place in order to check Russia. There were, of course, members who were still very focused on Russia and very wary that this new Russian Federation would prove to be as threatening as the Soviet Union had been. But it wasn't the reason for keeping the alliance alive. The rationale at the time for keeping the alliance alive and expanding it, as I understand it, and I was involved in European security issues at the time, and followed very closely the expansion, in particular to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, I think still at the time. Anyway, was to create stability, to foster political stability in Europe. As to become a member of NATO, you have to resolve all the border disputes that you have with your neighbors. You have to make sure that you are a fully fledged democracy, and that you are taking care of human rights and minority rights, group rights in your country. And so the idea was, if you had the NATO umbrella, if you achieved sort of domestic security, if you went through all the hoops you had to do in order to reorganize your defense establishment to be more democratic, be under civilian control, you would get the NATO security umbrella, and investment would follow. That's what it was all about, sort of in the 90s, from the perspective, at least, of Washington, that we were helping these countries rebuild and become fully fledged democracies with strong, competitive, capitalist economic systems. And to this day, that is still a large component of the NATO enlargement, the desire for countries to become part of NATO. I was very involved in the Montenegro process, the process of Montenegro becoming a member. However, the Russia component over time has become a real issue. So I won't go over that history, but Russia has become a threat to NATO members, including NATO members in the Balkans, as far away as North Macedonia. So the reality is that now NATO is also, once again, a check on Russia and its imperialist, revanchist, political, foreign and defense policy. So I just want to kind of put that out there, because I know there's a lot of people who put forward this argument that, this is all NATO's fault. We know very clearly that this is Russia's fault. They pointed a gun at the head of Ukraine, at the head of the Transatlantic Alliance, and more importantly, at the head of the global security system that we set up after World War II in order to prevent major global conflict. And that's why I'm really glad that President Biden is going on Monday to the United Nations, to the Security Council, to discuss Ukraine. I've been calling for that for a while now. Why? Because I think we, as an international community, as Ed mentioned and the ambassador mentioned, and you mentioned, David, we failed to respond appropriately. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, we didn't respond appropriately. And then in 2014, when Europe's borders were altered for the first time through the use of military force with the annexation of Crimea, that should have set off alarm bells, because that was the same as what Saddam Hussein did when he annexed Kuwait. And we marshaled a large coalition of the willing to push him back. Now, in that case, we were willing to use military force. In this case, of course, we don't want to use military force against Russia, a nuclear power. But nevertheless, we need to marshal all of our diplomatic forces. We should have done it already. We need to do it now, not just on the issue of Donbass and the future of Ukraine, but also on the Crimea issue. That needs to be resolved diplomatically. It can't remain as it is into the interminable future without a diplomatic effort on the part of the international community. So I know that we want to have you, David, ask us questions and open it to the audience. So I think I'll just stop there, and then we can talk about what we should do next. I have a piece in Defense One where I very clearly put out suggestions which the administration and the transatlantic community largely have adopted, especially with this latest decision to go to the Security Council. And I think we can beef up our deterrence, but we're doing the right thing right now with beefing up the deterrence with, essentially dangling punitive, very strong sanctions privately in front of the Russians. And so maybe we can deter Putin. I'm not yet convinced of that, but if we keep this up, if we stay united, maybe.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate that. Yeah, let's launch into a discussion with the three of you here, and then in a little bit we'll turn to questions from our viewers. Let me start with sort of the million-dollar question that Putin loves hearing us ask, which is, what is he up to? What are his objectives? You hear everything from recreation of the Soviet Union to destabilizing Ukraine so that it doesn't become a threatening alternative to the corrupt authoritarian system Putin oversees in Russia. You hear, Edward, you mentioned the sowing divisions in the West, which we enable, seeking concessions, closing the door on NATO. Jüri, let me start with you. A combination of those or some other factors, what do you think is driving Putin here?
Well, I think Putin actually started off with focusing on Ukraine because for him, the future of Ukraine is part of his sort of legacy agenda, kind of gathering back the lands which have been quote unquote stolen from him or from Russia. So if you read the articles of Putin and Medvedev from summer last year, then the agenda is pretty clear. I mean, they basically question the validity of the Ukrainian statehood. They don't accept the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian government. Essentially, they don't accept Ukraine as a sovereign state. And it is all part of the agenda of bringing Ukraine back. Putin has been in power indeed longer than Leonid Brezhnev now, so he's really a very long-term Russian leader, clearly somebody who is searching for his place in the long history of Russia. And Ukraine is both historic, civilizational, psychological kind of centerpiece of his aggressive policies. But of course, he widened the battlefield to mold, to create more favorable conditions for himself. And of course, part of that creating a more comfortable battlefield was essentially to blame NATO. I mean, to blame NATO for moving towards Russian borders, building infrastructure, putting offensive weapons to Ukraine. Putin has said several times that there are large NATO troops in Ukraine, which is obviously totally false, as well as many other things. So we have to be very careful in keeping in mind that we shouldn't engage in a diplomatic kind of back and forth, which would forget the need of solving the Ukrainian crisis, including getting the troops sort of away from Ukraine, back to their bases, the de-escalation. I mean, if we get too enthusiastic about, arms control and discussing all these big things in high-level, fancy negotiations, then we forget that Putin's main focus is actually on getting Ukraine. And he might think that he can actually do two things together. He might try to sort of get back Ukraine with various means, perhaps also military, and at the same time try to keep the sort of the negotiating track on other issues alive. So I think we have to be very careful in asking ourselves, what are we actually negotiating about? And how does it help? How does our particular negotiations help Ukraine? Because we shouldn't sort of indirectly or by default accept the position that somehow in some ways NATO is, if not to be blamed, but at least partly to be blamed for what is happening, creating tensions, moving infrastructure. This is the public narrative which Russians have been relatively skillful in pushing. I mean, obviously, we are here in the security community. None of us buys it. But I mean, the public in large, I think they've had some success. And obviously, there are also people in the security community and among analysts who also believe that. People who were perhaps critical of NATO enlargement to begin with. So this is clearly an issue which needs very, very careful handling.
And just on that point, Jüri, of course, when Putin first invaded in 2014, Ukraine was a non-aligned state. President Yanukovych had signed legislation eliminating aspirations for joining NATO. So NATO enlargement had nothing to do with the first invasion. Edward, let me turn to you and ask you that question of what is Putin up to here?
That Putin's trying to do two things. He's trying to use the West against Ukraine and Ukraine against the West. The aim for against Ukraine is to make Ukraine into the sort of neighbor that Russia wants: ineffective, divisive, not attractive, divided, not attractive, easily controlled. A sort of somewhere between. Well, sort of thing he's got in somewhere like Armenia or Tajikistan, or the way Moldova used to be. And for the Ukrainians to feel abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten by the West is a very good way of achieving that goal. He wants to undermine the pro-Western camp in Ukraine fundamentally, and that would be through some combination of maybe military defeat where they don't get the help they need, or being arm twisted by the West in some kind of new Munich or Yalta settlement. But this also works the other way, that the West is very divided over Ukraine. You have countries that basically take the Russian point of view. Italy seems to be in that camp at the moment. Countries that are very strongly pro-Ukraine, Estonia, Britain among them. But we don't really have a common position. That's been the case since the disastrous Bucharest summit of 2008 that some people on this call were present at. And so he sees that this is a really good wedge issue, and he's saying to the West, how much do you really care about Ukraine? And how much will you care if the United States imposes sanctions on me and I impose gas sanctions on you in return? Are you really going to tell your voters that the lights are going off, they're losing their jobs, there's going to be shortages of fertilizer and chemicals because there's no Russian gas coming? Are you really going to tell your voters that the support for Ukraine and for the United States and the transatlantic alliance was worth that? And there's at least a chance he'll be right, and there'll be some countries that say, no, please turn the, forget the Ukrainians, forget the Americans, turn the gas back on. So I think it's a well-calibrated approach by him, and it fundamentally goes to this idea of divide and rule and have a large buffer zone around Russia of countries that Russia can dominate and which don't threaten Russia.
Great, Edward, thank you so much. Evelyn, that question to you, what is he up to?
So I think it's all of the elements that you mentioned, David. They're intertwined. So the first thing to understand is that Vladimir Putin wants to preserve his autocratic, kleptocratic system. In order to do that, he believes that he needs to exercise a sphere of influence over the kind of former Soviet space, and he is very much informed by kind of a Russian imperialist perspective. It's revanchist. And he would like to go back to a 19th century sphere of influence system whereby these states do not have the right to exercise their own sovereignty, that Moscow can essentially rule over them, dominate them. He does not want any democracies inside this sphere of influence. So Ukraine, if it were a flourishing democracy with a competitive economic system, would pose a danger to Putin. He recognizes that his people might look over the border and say, we would like that too. And let's not forget that, as you said, David, well, you didn't actually say this, but the other part of what you could have said was that in 2014, when the Ukrainians went to the streets to protest their pro-Russian leader, they were protesting the fact that Viktor Yanukovych said, we're not going to join the European Union. And the Ukrainians were outraged, especially younger Ukrainians, because they had looked over the border at Poland, a place where they were used to sort of looking down on historically, and saw that the Poles were doing quite well economically because of their membership in the European Union. And so the Ukrainian people wanted to join the European Union. And in fact, as Ambassador Dan Baer said once in a meeting in the Obama administration, the only people who have shed blood for the European Union are the Ukrainians, literally. So I would say that what's at stake here is the fact that Putin wants to maintain power. And in order to maintain power, he thinks he needs the sphere of influence system. Well, the sphere of influence system predates the Second World War and the establishment of the United Nations, the UN Charter, the system that we have established that has kept us safe from a large-scale global war. What Putin is trying to do is pull us back into that very dangerous situation. And of course, we haven't mentioned it yet, but the Chinese and others are watching very closely because they also have their territorial interests. And leaving China aside, just turning back to Europe, we can all very quickly envision what a disaster it would be. The first person to raise his hand would be Putin's buddy, Viktor Orban, who would say, well, I actually would like a piece of Ukraine too. And also 4 other countries that have taken pieces of Hungarian territory in the past. So this kind of revanchist sphere of influence mentality is the way that Putin thinks he can maintain power, but it's very dangerous to the global order.
Thank you. We will get to questions from our viewers in just a few minutes. Please send in any you have through the Q&A function. Jüri, let me ask you, yesterday's readout of the phone call between President Biden and President Zelensky seemed to indicate that there are different messages that they are sending each other. The United States seems to be stressing that a major invasion is in fact likely. It's going to happen. Ukraine needs to get ready for it. The Ukrainian side seems concerned that that message, together with the pulling out of American families and non-essential employees from the embassy, that is sending a message of panic in Ukraine. How do you see the level of concern there in NATO? What is NATO's position on this?
NATO is very concerned. We really share the view of the United States. And of course, there are constant ongoing consultations with the United States. And both the United States and other allies are sort of briefing each other in keeping up the awareness, the situational awareness of what is happening around Ukraine. And obviously, NATO has a number of structures which deal with the same issues. So we really see the picture, and the picture is very disturbing. And while we perhaps in the beginning saw it mainly as something which was focused on the, if you will, southern part of Ukraine, now we of course see big amounts of troops moving to Belarus, including some very sophisticated weaponry, S-400, etc., etc. So there is deep concern. But in a way, I understand the dilemma which the Ukrainian leadership finds itself in, because I mean, Russians wouldn't like anything more than, you know, the whole population of Ukraine being put on a war footing, and by that sort of destroying the Ukrainian state or destabilizing the Ukrainian state from inside. So I think the desire to keep some level of stability, some level of normalcy, the operation of the if you will, the civilian part of the state and the society, I think that's quite natural. Of course, it is a huge and dramatic dilemma for the Ukrainian president. I think none of us would want to focus this kind of extremely dramatic choice. Now, when it comes to the actual attack, actual decision to attack, then of course everybody repeats that this is the decision by President Putin. And I mean, it's true, let's face it. And we don't know whether he has made that decision. Also, and this is a larger issue, which I won't even bring to this debate. I'm simply saying it as a general sort of observation of the 20th century, that for a country who will be attacked or who is facing attack, it is very difficult to judge the actual moment where the attack is inevitable. If you think through the big battles or big aggressions of the Second World War, starting from the Winter War in Finland, or let's say Pearl Harbor, or number of other big attacks, then the country who was kind of the victim for that leadership, for that nation, it's very difficult, you know, to judge this moment, the situation of a particular moment. The same goes with Estonia. I mean, when Estonia was occupied, I mean, again, in 1939 and 1940, there were many people also in the government who hoped for the best. But sometimes this hope doesn't bear out. So it's really devil of a dilemma. Thanks.
Jüri, thank you. Edward, let me ask you, there are some people who argue we need to give Russia a taste of its own medicine, which is to say, return the information war campaign and try not to disinform Russians or feed them lies, but to actually expose more of the corruption of the Putin regime and tell them what's really happening. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do we do it?
I do agree with that, and I think the fact that Navalny is in jail shows how much the Kremlin doesn't like it. And one thing I always urge people to do is to go to YouTube and watch the Navalny channel and look and see if there's anything in your country that he's highlighted that you could follow up, because one of the points about Russian corruption is the money is stolen in Russia and it's sometimes spent in Russia, these grotesque palaces and things, but it goes via the West, and there's a lot we can do in exposing the enablers in the West and making them sweat a bit and making them less willing to take on Russian clients. I find it slightly frustrating that we've had the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and other sort of exposés showing just how much the Russian elite uses the institutions and systems of the West, which it so claims to despise. And we don't seem to get cross enough about that. So I think prosecuting economic crime properly, something my country is lamentably bad at doing, would be good. And I'd like to see more sort of global counter-kleptocracy task forces that go both into the exposition and into the prosecution of these sort of tentacles of kleptocratic power. I also think there's a lot more we can do inside Russia to highlight a sort of more positive narrative. And Putin's got this quite clear, if contradictory, mixture of Russia as a besieged fortress, grudges dating back to the sack of Constantinople and the perfidy of the Catholics against the Orthodox, through to right up to NATO expansion, all stitched together in a sort of single, resentful, grievance-laden narrative, coupled with the idea that only a very strong power can run a country like Russia because it's so big, playing on the memories of the 1990s and the chaos and humiliation, which were certainly aspects of life then. And it's, we can laugh at it and say, but none of this actually fits together. How can you have Soviet nostalgia together with Tsarist nostalgia when they would have shot each other on sight? In fact, did in the Russian Civil War. But that's not really the point. Consistency is for us, not for them. But we could push back with a much stronger positive narrative, and I would love to see more being done on the glories of Russian culture, literature, art, and so on, particularly highlighting things that are no longer able to appear inside Russia, the proper teaching of Russian history. I'm a tremendous fan of what Lithuania has been doing on this with the Sakharov Center in Kaunas and the great efforts that the former Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linas Linkevičius made to keep ties with the Russian opposition. And we have a big advantage. We have countries all around Russia, from Finland round to Ukraine and Georgia, which Russians can get to, where Russian is widely spoken, where you can conduct surrogate sort of Russian academic and intellectual and cultural things, and show to the Russians we're on their side. We love Akhmatova just as much as you do, and try and get a sort of positive message, so it's not just seen as resisting imperialist aggression, important though that is, but also about celebrating what one might call the real Russia, or at least a real Russia, which the Putin regime has so occluded.
Edward, thank you very much. Evelyn, let me with you start turning to some of the audience questions, because we have quite a few that have come in.
And they're really good.
They
the
are
ones that I saw.
Exactly. And one is from Randy. I don't know if that's Randy Schuneman, but if it is, we'll start with his. He asks, if Putin decides to further invade Ukraine once the ground is fully frozen and turns, say, Kharkiv into Grozny a la 1995, will Europe and the US respond more forcefully than imposing economic sanctions?
Well, the Biden administration and the NATO allies have been clear that they will respond by continuing to provide support to Ukraine to defend itself, to fight either a conventional war or an insurgency. So that will continue. Of course, sanctions, the harshest sanctions, will come down on Putin. If none of that works, then I would imagine we would just ratchet up both of those. And again, I've also called for a full-scale diplomatic effort at the UN to put pressure on Russia. I understand that China is a member of the Security Council. China's, tacitly, well, actively backing on the NATO question, tacitly backing on an invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese will abstain from any real action, but we still need to put pressure on Russia and make the points. The principles matter, just as we did during the Cold War when we didn't cede the fact that the Baltic states were not part of the Soviet Union. They were independent states that they had a separate legal situation there, which the ambassador knows very well. So, I think that's important, but I also would like to associate myself with the comments that Ed made, because I think we need to be more proactive and we need to escalate, if you will, horizontally, meaning we need to create more problems for Putin. We need to publicize all of his corruption and that of his cronies. We need to make sure that there's more transparency in the international economic system, clamp down on global corruption. We need to also address areas where Russia's meddling, where our own foreign policy has been lacking strategically. So for example, Syria. So those are all opportunities for Putin to cause trouble for us, but they're also opportunities for us to put pressure on Putin.
Great, thank you. Jüri, this question is for you from Josh Rogan, who asks, how confident are you that NATO, in this case, the North Atlantic Council, will quickly approve the deployment of the NATO response force to frontline states like Estonia if the situation deteriorates in such a way that calls for it? Are you concerned NATO could get bogged down in bureaucracy or disagreements about approving this deployment, and how would it operate? If so, would you prefer Biden just send reinforcements to the Baltic states based on bilateral agreements now?
I mean, just sitting here at NATO and participating in the discussions, including the sort of the military piece of defending alliance territory and deterring enemies, I'm pretty sure that VJTF will be sent to protect an ally and to deter aggression should that become necessary. But there is no doubt that NATO has always operated also with troops which are not in peacetime in NATO structure. I mean, the troops of allies. This happened in 2014 when Crimea was attacked, and the US government, Obama administration, decided to send companies of American soldiers to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in fact, creating the first forward position deterrent force in these three countries. And this wasn't part of the NATO's deployment per se, but it was one NATO ally kind of supporting other NATO allies. You know, when you read the Washington Treaty, there is nothing about invoking Article 5. There is Article 5. We have all signed it. So we have a mutual defense obligation to each other. And of course, we use the best possible means which are at our disposal at a given moment. So the question of a particular unit, whether it's a NATO unit or a unit which comes from a member states, for me, that is not so important as such, as long as the sort of the idea or the letter of Article 5 is fulfilled.
Thank you. Edward, Milana Mazeyeva, a Chechen journalist, asks, experts in Russia believe that war is not beneficial for Putin since the victims of this war will lead to an even greater drop in his ratings. Do you agree that Putin is using the threat of war for other purposes? If so, which ones?
Yes, I think that the threat of war is much cheaper than an actual war. The threat has to be credible. And I don't rule out that there will be fighting. My guess is that it's more likely there would be a limited incursion, perhaps to seize the canal that supplies Crimea with fresh water, at a slightly larger scale, possibly Mariupol, and creating a land bridge to Crimea. It may be just get some precision strikes within Ukrainian territory, perhaps hitting military or infrastructure targets, which would leave Ukraine in a very difficult position. They can't really counterattack because they don't have the ability to fire things inside Russia. They might have done if they'd been able to get those German howitzers from Estonia, but Germany's blocked that. But it's tricky. I think Putin understands judo very well. And he is keeping his opponent guessing to the last moment, and will make sure he will do whatever affects our sense of balance, which is his sort of strategic thinking. That's a dog in the background agreeing with me, but not my dog. I think that the body bags would be a serious problem for him if you had large numbers of casualties. So I think he probably won't go down that road. The Russian population is not gagging for war, and it's not like 2014 when people were absolutely thrilled about getting Crimea back and what they saw as a sort of ending a historical injustice. I wonder whether he'll find something else to give them, and possibly something with Belarus, the sort of annexation of, quasi-annexation of Belarus, or the full military integration of Belarus into Russian Federation military structures, that this could be portrayed as a sort of geopolitical trophy that has been gained as a result of standing up to the West. I'm always very cautious about making predictions about what Putin will do, or indeed trying to psychoanalyze him about what he thinks, because these predictions are almost always wrong. So I'm sorry not to give a more precise answer, but I do think that already he's gained quite a lot. And when I see people saying we've got to give Putin an off-ramp, as Macron, there seems to have been talks just now between the French and the Russians about de-escalation, and this worries me a lot. The only thing that's needed for de-escalation is for Russia to stop escalating. We have, as Jüri said earlier, we haven't been doing the escalating. This is a problem. This has been a crisis that has been created by Russia and instrumentalized by Russia for political purposes and for political goals, which to some extent have already been achieved.
Edward, thank you. And I can confirm that my dog Missy violently agreed with what you said. So Evelyn, let me ask you a question from Sandra Kaduri, who asks, instead of allowing Putin to set the agenda, shouldn't we have immediately countered with demands for Russia to pull out of Ukraine and Georgia? And she has a few others. Was it a mistake to have agreed to these talks without insisting on a full and verifiable withdrawal of Russian forces from the border with Ukraine?
No, because Putin wouldn't do it if we asked him to do it anyway. And I think having the door open for negotiations is always better than not doing it. Again, during the Cold War, as one of you said earlier, you know, we negotiated with Brezhnev, so we should negotiate with Putin. We should always keep those lines of diplomacy open. But she also raised the issue about disinformation, and she and another person in the chat talked about meddling in our democracies and the cyber attacks. And I do think that our approach on all of these, in terms of maybe behind the scenes it's been strong, but I think our public diplomacy, our international diplomacy, our rallying of the international community has been insufficient.
Great, thanks. Jüri, this question from our own Paul Fagan with the McCain Institute. He says, we talked a lot about Russia's imminent attack on Ukraine. How can the NATO alliance take on Russia's ongoing cyber war, the disinformation campaign that has influenced public opinion in the US and Europe? What can we do that is more proactive?
Well, it's you know, one of the benefits, but also limitations of democracies, that we don't necessarily attack first, so to say. And this goes for cyber as well as all other means and tools. I think clearly, I mean, let's cast aside the military and intelligence realm for a second. I mean, one of the very dangerous aspects of the cyberspace and social media is, of course, the ability, the uncanny ability of Putin to use it for pushing his own narrative. And I think it is extremely important that we would counter or even press our own narrative. That's why I was very concerned when, in the beginning, when Putin started to peddle this NATO is kind of invading the Russian space, NATO is such an aggressive force, etc., that we sort of focused only on negotiations. I was saying then, as I'm saying now, it is also very important to fight the narrative. And I think we have improved now and sort of turned this situation into our benefit as well. I very much like the speech of Secretary Blinken in Berlin, when he actually addressed not only the kind of the technical problems of warfare, but came out very strongly by explaining what NATO is, that it's a defensive alliance, that it's an alliance in fact created to maintain peace in Europe and has been very successful. And Russia is wholly to be blamed for this situation. I think Secretary General Stoltenberg has been very good in pushing the message, sort of actively promoting NATO as a force for good. I mean, sometimes we have to use kind of a very simple ideas, very simple kind of not very nuanced blocks of messages, but very simple, very clear messages. And Stoltenberg is doing it very well, and Russians are greatly annoyed by it. Lavrov has pointed out several times how he disliked Stoltenberg in the most tasteless and rude and undiplomatic way. So clearly it gets to them, and it's good, because this is a fight for the public information space. This is a fight for consciousness, for understanding the good and bad forces, the righteous and those who are aggressors, etc., etc. So this is very important.
Edward, let me ask you a question that stems from legislative proposals from Senator Menendez, but also House Republicans calling for sanctions on Putin himself and the immediate circle around him. This elicited a rather vociferous response from Peskov, who said this would essentially be the end of relations. What do you think of going after Putin himself?
The problem with going after Putin himself is that it won't produce any real results. It's a symbolic move because Putin keeps his money, and of which there is an enormous amount, in accounts and through different channels that are controlled by proxies. You know, a cellist here, a chef there, former friends from his old days in Dresden. We all know these names. We aren't allowed to talk about them in Britain because you get hit with a libel suit for implying that they've done anything that's not even illegal, anything that's dishonorable. So I have to pick my words carefully. So I think it has a sort of, I mean, it looks good, but I think that we've got a much deeper problem, which is the Kremlin elite who have, when you say, where do you get your money from if you're doing a money laundering check, they say, I own a bank, or I own an oil company, or I own a shipping company. And it's quite hard for these sort of money laundering checks that just go for source of wealth verification to trip these people up. So I mean, I applaud Senator Menendez for his focus on the issue, and it may well be from a sort of symbolic level this is going to work. But I think if we really want to make things difficult for the Kremlin, we have to clean up the way our financial and legal system works. They're exploiting things that are deep-seated weaknesses in our system. And if we want to tackle them, it's better to tackle the weakness rather than just the person who may be exploiting them.
Evelyn, a question that comes from our friend Batu Kutelia in Tbilisi, who asks, with Russia, the West is mostly resorting to proactive diplomacy and reactive actions. Why don't we do it vice versa? Proactive actions and reactive diplomacy.
Well, thank you, Batu, for the question and for tuning in. I would say that the Russians are being more proactive across the board, both diplomatically and otherwise. I mean, they're the ones who started this, who escalated us and issued the ultimatum to Ukraine and the West. We, however, I would have to agree, have been, and I said it earlier, or at least I hinted at it, we've been reactive. You know, everything that we've done, and this goes back to, 2008, we've reacted to Putin largely, rather than trying to wrest the agenda from him, wrest the initiative from him, because we were preoccupied with other challenges. There's been an enduring desire, it's a transatlantic one, to focus on other challenges, whether they're domestic economic challenges, combating terrorism, the Middle East crises, and now more recently China, and to ignore the very real threat and challenges posed by Russia. Almost as if, because the Soviet Union, where Russia's the legacy of the Soviet Union, because we dealt with that problem and we took care of it in the past, it shouldn't bother us anymore. So I think, unfortunately, the global community has been reactive when it comes to Russia. And I would like us to be more proactive. I would like us to think about how we can, put Putin off balance. We haven't done a sufficient job doing that. So Batu, if you have any ideas, send them our way.
On mute. There we are. We only have about 7 minutes left. So I want to ask the three of you for quick answers to a tough question, which is, and apologies to the other people who had sent in questions that we weren't able to get to them. Thank you, though, for tuning in and sending in your questions. Here we are on January 28th, 2022. We are facing a crisis. What recommendations would you have for NATO in dealing with the threat posed by Mr. Putin in light of this crisis, or even more broadly? Jüri, we'll start with you. What would you like to see NATO do?
Well, I'm around the council table, so it would really be great if the other panelists would start. I can then say whether it's feasible or not.
Don't do that. Yes, go right ahead. Edward, go ahead, please.
Yes, I think what I would like to see is what my friend and SEPA colleague, General Retired Ben Hodges, has been suggesting. We need a military exercise in the Baltics, and quite a big one, and out as a snap exercise, because I think that it's very important that we show that NATO is absolutely solid in defending its flanks. I'd also like to see something happening in the Black Sea, because there's a kind of dynamic here which is taking root in some quarters, that NATO has provoked Russia. That's where we've got the crisis. So part of any answer is that NATO mustn't provoke Russia anymore, and let's not do things that Russia doesn't like. And I'm very worried that may, I would say very worried, I'm concerned that this may start impeding the very necessary NATO efforts and allied efforts to improve security in the Baltic Sea region. I've spent the last year working on the Baltic Sea regional security for 2 big SEPA reports. And it's kind of okay, but it could be a lot better. We need maritime strategy, we need air and missile defense, we need better ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, we need much more exercises, we need we need common threat assessments. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this slightly sort of Rube Goldberg world of Baltic Sea security, particularly as we can't trust Germany, and the mistrust of Germany is underlined by Germany's behavior right now. So we actually have a big agenda for this year and next year in improving things, and I'm worried that that's going to be derailed as part of some kind of confidence building measures. So what I would like to see is a big snap reinforcement of the Baltic states and the Baltic Sea region, involving lots of heavy traffic, both within the NATO members, but also in the Sweden and Finland. I would like to see perhaps a US airborne landing on Gotland. That would be good. Something on Bornholm, something big involving Finland, maybe a big air exercise, but really show that the United States and the other allies are really committed to this, and there is no daylight between us, and we are not going to in the least give in to sort of Russian mind games where we think that defending ourselves is somehow bad and needs to be atoned for or curbed.
Edward, thank you. Evelyn, over to you, please.
Well, there are a lot of things I would like to see NATO do. First, with regard to Ukraine, I would like to see NATO, even though, of course, there's no Article 5 protection to Ukraine, but NATO could provide, through its members, air defenses to Ukraine, strategic air defenses, as well as maritime defenses, maritime surveillance. So I think we need to do a better job helping Ukrainians as an alliance. And if it can't be done as an alliance directly, then the alliance should encourage it. In addition to that, I would like to see the alliance really tackle the issue of cyber attacks and attacks in space, and make it clear that cyber attacks and attacks in space, so meaning on our satellites, will be regarded as an Article 5 type attack because of the impact, because of the effects of such attacks. So I would like to see NATO take that on more robustly. And then, of course, diplomatically, if the SecGen goes with President Biden and other heads of state to the United Nations and makes the point over and over again that what Russia is doing is threatening the international order, that would be fantastic. In effect, and in reality, the United Nations exists under the umbrella of the NATO exists under the umbrella of the United Nations. So I think there's a lot more that NATO can do to bolster its own security. I agree with all the points that Ed made, but there's a lot more that we can do to address the asymmetric threats and helping Ukraine.
Evelyn, thank you. Jüri, last words for the panel from you, please.
Well, I think there are a number of things which one can do. The most important aspect for me is to keep the Allied unity. There are 30 countries. I think we have been relatively successful. I mean, there are problems here and there, but considering the high stakes in play, we have been relatively successful in keeping all allies at the same page. And this was well reflected by the responses which were given both by US and NATO to Russia. But I think it is very important what Ed said, which is that our deterrence should be proactive, and the exercises, the show of strength should be part of that proactiveness. And indeed, when Russia is now pushing troops to Belarus, very close to the strategically important Suwalki Gap, NATO has to make clear that this is something which we regard as a serious challenge, and NATO should react adequately. And as I said, even if NATO doesn't do certain things, nobody absolved the allies for not doing it. I mean, the fact that there are issues where NATO as an organization cannot find consensus does not mean that countries who have more capabilities and more readiness to step up would do that. The biggest risk for me today is, and this was also hinted by other panelists, that although Putin doesn't achieve formal guarantees, he might achieve this kind of a new mental space where somehow kind of dealing with Eastern Europe in military terms is seen as more risky, kind of, again, shaping our way of thinking, thinking of our allies. So that kind of non-official or unofficial understanding is, I think, something which is extremely risky. And the same goes for Ukraine. I mean, kind of achieving the understanding, if you will, that it would be very difficult for Ukraine to get to NATO, even if no documents are signed. This is something which I see as a major risk from looking at the situation as it stands now.
Ambassador Jüri Luik, Edward Lucas, and Evelyn Farkas, I think, who disappeared from the screen, but thanks so much for a terrific panel discussion. Really appreciate your taking the time to join us, and huge thanks, of course, to Paul and the great team at the McCain Institute for putting this session together, and this is part of a series that the McCain Institute is producing. So stay tuned for upcoming sessions on this, and I'll turn it back over to Paul. Thank you again to the three of you for doing such a great job. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, let me just reiterate a great big thanks to David for moderating this session. Thanks to the ambassador, Edward, and Evelyn. I think her internet must have gone down, unfortunately, but thank you, Evelyn.
Again, it was the Russians.
It was the Russians, you know, shutting her down. But again, we're the McCain Institute. We're carrying on the legacy of Senator McCain, and he would be at the front lines in the Donbass with their Ukrainians facing the, you know, the Russian threat. So thank you for all of you for your efforts and keeping up the legacy of Senator McCain and those who are fighting for the future of Ukraine. But also we wanted to thank the U.S. NATO mission, who's supporting a project on the future of NATO and the effects of mis and disinformation. So thank you again to our audience for tuning in. Check out our website, mccaininstitute.org, and then on our Twitter and Instagram feeds. Thank you and have a good weekend, and we'll stay tuned to the latest on what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. Thank you again for everyone.